Fourth International Forum on Food and Nutrition.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Danielle Nierenberg, and I am the director of the Nourishing the Planet project at the Worldwatch Institute. Gunning for something else there. I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome you to our event this morning. This is the official U.S. launch of the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition's book, Eating Planet. Eating Planet includes chapters, vignettes, and interviews with some of the leading thinkers on food and agriculture in the world, and many of them are with us today, and I'm so thrilled to have them there. Worldwatch and Nourishing the Planet are extremely excited about this joint collaboration with Barilla. This book is not only a powerful analysis of the connections between the food system, nutrition, and environmental sustainability, it is a perfect complement to the work my colleagues and I at Nourishing the Planet have done over the last 3 years. This book focuses on Barilla Center's 4 main issue areas: food for all, food for sustainability, food for health, and food for culture. I had the honor of writing the first chapter for Eating Planet, and the chapter is really based on the research that I was able to do over the last 3 years for Nourishing the Planet. I spent about 3 years on the ground visiting more than 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, visiting more than 350 projects. And that research really clarified for me and my colleagues that agriculture can be the solution to some of the world's most pressing environmental and social challenges. We were really able to see the impact that sustainable and diverse farming systems can have on health, on nutrition and food security, and on people's livelihoods. Eating Planet highlights how farmers, scientists, nutritionists, NGOs, and again, the same people in this room are finding ways to combat both hunger and obesity, protect and preserve indigenous foods, create resilience to climate change in agriculture, engage youth in farming, improve nutrition and diversify diets, and increase incomes for small-scale farmers all over the world. I just came back from the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio, and many of the issues that are highlighted in Eating Planet were talked about at that event. Food waste and post-harvest losses, issues that have been long ignored by both policymakers and the international funding and donor communities, were really brought to the table in a big way with the Zero Hunger program that was launched at Rio. The dual problems of obesity and hunger were discussed on high-level panels with representatives of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, USAID, and the World Health Organization, and they are now more of a global priority. And access to resources and extension and training for farmers are now seen as crucial aspects of not only global development, but also of ensuring that agriculture can be a sustainable and reliable source of income for farmers. And while books and reports and conferences can't save the world alone, Eating Planet holds important lessons for consumers, for farmers, and for policymakers. Again, I'm truly honored that Nourishing the Planet could be a part of this endeavor. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our panel and our moderator, and I'll describe a little bit about how today's program will work. First, let me say that the group of people you see before you are literally my favorite people in the world. The best part of my job has always been getting to meet people who are so passionate about the work that they do to help both alleviate hunger and poverty, but also protect the environment. So I'm really thrilled that you all could be here, and I'm so thrilled that so many friends of ours are in the room. I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone. The bios are in the packets, the lovely packets you received at the door, and their information is also available on both the Nourishing the Planet and the Barilla Center websites. Each of the panelists will be asked a question by our moderator, Samuel Fromartz, and they'll have 10 minutes to respond. Panelists, I really ask that you keep time. We'll have someone who, our colleague Molly, I don't know where she is, but she'll wave. There she is right there. She'll hold up a sign when you have both 5 minutes and 2 minutes left. So we just really want to make sure that we're leaving enough time for questions from the audience, the live stream, and our Facebook and Twitter accounts. I really am excited to have Samuel Fromartz here. He'll be acting as your moderator this morning. Sam is a former business journalist, the author of the book Organic Inc., and he's currently the editor-in-chief of the Food and Environmental Reporting Network, which is an exciting initiative that does investigative reporting on food, agriculture, and environmental health. We also have my former colleague and longtime friend, Brian Halweil. Brian worked for more than 10 years, at the Worldwatch Institute, where he directed our food and agriculture work. Brian wrote the book Eat Here, Finding Homegrown Pleasures in a Global Supermarket, and he's the editor of Edible East End and the co-publisher of both Edible Brooklyn and Edible Manhattan. I'm also excited to have Jonathan Bloom with us today. Jonathan is a journalist and researcher who wrote the book American Wasteland, which talks about the tremendous amount of food that we waste in the United States. And he's now working on a project to assess global food waste. We also have Stephanie Hanson, who is another former journalist. She is currently the Director of Policy and Outreach at the One Acre Fund, an organization that's based in Eastern Africa that works directly with small-scale farmers. Kelly Hauser joins us from the One campaign, where she is the policy manager focusing on agriculture, nutrition, and U.S. food aid reform. I'm also very pleased to introduce Ellen Gustafson. Ellen is the newest member of the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition Advisory Board. She's also the co-founder of FEED and the executive director of the 30 Project. And last but not least on our panel, I'd like to introduce Dan Morrison. Dan is the founder of a group called Citizen Effect, which is an exciting and innovative philanthropy platform which helps people like you and me find ways to support small, impactful projects in both the U.S. and developing countries. Now it is my very great pleasure to introduce via video live stream Paolo Barilla, the vice president of Barilla, who is joining us from Parma, Italy this morning. Mr. Barilla is going to talk very briefly about the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition's important work and why the center was founded.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paolo Barilla, the Vice President of the Barilla Group, and I wish I could be there with you in New York today, but extend a very warm welcome from Italy on behalf of Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition. I would like to thank our partner, the Worldwatch Institute, and the WNYC Studios for hosting this event today. Today, we are very proud to introduce Eating Planet, the first book from BCFN in collaboration with the Worldwatch Institute. Eating Planet highlights the challenges facing today food and agricultural system, as well as the multiple of benefits that reform could bring. Let me explain by sharing some of the staggering statistics. Worldwide, 30% of food is wasted. 1 billion people go to bed hungry each night, while another 1 billion suffer from a problem related to obesity. Meanwhile, young people are increasingly disconnected from how their food is grown. Agricultural system contributes 1/3 of the global greenhouse gases emission, seems even further out of reach. These are massive problems facing the world today. As a company, we are so committed to improve nutrition, and in 2009, we established the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition, a think tank dedicated to elevating these major global issues, encouraging debate and proposing concrete solutions through a multidisciplinary perspective. In our first 3 years, the BCFN has investigated a broad range of topics from climate change, nutrition and health, food waste and obesity, to a sustainable food chain, through published articles, education, webinars, and public forums, including the 4th Annual International Forum of Food and Nutrition that is held in November 28 and 29 in Milan, Italy, and most recently, our first book, Eating Planet. I am also honored to welcome Helen Gustafson as a newest member of BCFN Advisory Board. Helen's significant commitment to addressing hunger and obesity will allow her to contribute an invaluable perspective to the discussion today and as we continue to advance our goal of the BCFN in the future. Today, we invite you to participate in a discussion with the internationally recognized experts and challenge you to think about creative solutions to a major global food issues outlined in Eating Planet. Following the discussion, I hope you take time to read the Eating Planet and consider what it can do as an individual, as a member of a society as well. Thank you again for attending, and I hope you will enjoy the day and the discussion. And later, I hope you will even read the book. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Sam now to start the panel.
I just want to thank Danielle and Barilla Center and the panel. Did you get it? Okay, and the audience, thank you for being here. So as Danny mentioned, my organization, the Food and Environment Reporting Network, we're a journalist organization, and basically what we do is tell stories, and we report in depth on issues involving food, agriculture, and environmental health. In one story, we came across a woman in the South. She used to work on an assembly line in a car manufacturing plant, but in the depths of the recession, she lost her job, and she was living in her own house, supporting a daughter, and she had never been in this position before. And in this story, one thing she said really struck me. It really stood out. And she said, when you look in your refrigerator and it's empty, she said, you look at food different. And I think the thing that struck me about that is our perceptions, our understanding of what I'll call the food system, it's often shaped about where we stand and our relationship to it. And what I appreciated about this book, Eating Planet, which I did read, I highly recommend, is that it tries to deepen our understanding and maybe shift those perceptions. And it does so by focusing on 4 broad themes that we'll get in today. And that is food for all, and that's who has it and who doesn't and why. The second area is food for sustainability. That's how do we produce food in a way that ensures current supplies, but also make sure that we have food in the future. The third area is food for health, because as we know, food paradoxically can nourish us or also hurt us. And then finally, we'll talk about food for culture, and that is, how do our cultures inform the way we eat, and what kind of inherent knowledge is there that we can tap? And so one thing about these areas, in a lot of articles we read and a lot of studies that are produced, is they're looked at in silos. They're looked at in depth, but kind of disconnected. And one thing I appreciate about this book is that it makes the connections between these areas and shows how they're interrelated, because ultimately you can't really consider one without considering the other. And hopefully in this panel today, we'll get into those connections and draw the lines between these areas. So I'll start off with Brian, who will address this food for all question. So, Brian, in the introduction to this book, Guido Barilla describes the paradox of the underfed and overfed world, something that was mentioned today in these video remarks. And I know you first talked about this in 2000 in a Worldwatch report. And I'm wondering if you could discuss that today. Is, why do we have 1 billion people who go hungry at the same time that we have nearly 1 billion people who are overweight and suffering from health-related problems from that? Can you get into that?
Yeah, I also, but before I get into that, just did want to praise the report, which I had a chance to read online in the digital edition. It's, I think it's noteworthy that it's very readable, that it's beautifully put together, which is not always the case with reports on these sorts of topics. There's a nice diverse set of voices, and one point I wanted to make, because I think it's relevant to our whole discussion today, is because it is coming from a global food brand, Barilla, it perhaps has the potential to influence other global food brands in a major way, and I hope we can think of that community as more of an ally in a lot of these discussions. That dichotomy that the vice president from Barilla mentioned and that you mentioned of, 1 billion or more people who are hungry and 1 billion or more people who are also overweight is really astonishing. And about 10 years ago at Worldwatch, when we put together that estimate for the first time, looking at the statistics that the World Health Organization had on the number of overweight and obese and the statistics they had on the number of hungry, we were surprised that those numbers were sort of equal worldwide. And maybe now, a decade or so later, we wouldn't be surprised at that. And the reality is, we also assumed that over time, those numbers would begin to change. We assumed that the number of hungry on the planet would go down because that was the prevailing trend, and that the number of overweight and obese people would continue to go up as obesity moved to poorer countries and as it continued to expand in wealthy countries. And it's worth noting that both of those populations have increased in the last 10 years. So the world is losing its battle against hunger, so to speak. The number of hungry people on the planet is actually increasing each year, according to the best statistics we can get. At the same time, although we know it comes with massive health costs and consequences for quality of life, the number of overweight and obese people on the planet is growing in this country, in poorer countries. It's growing in those same countries where the number of hungry people is also growing, which is, ironic. So at their root, the hunger and obesity are of course, very different problems with very different causes. Briefly, there are more than 1 billion people on the planet who are hungry, largely because they cannot afford to buy food or the means to grow food on their own land. And in contrast, there are more than 1 billion people on the planet who are overweight or obese, largely because they're in an unhealthy food environment where they have access to large quantities, too much of unhealthy foods combined with a lifestyle that might include very little physical activity and all other sorts of things that contribute to becoming overweight and obese. So they might seem like very different problems on the surface, but they really are the two sides of the same coin. And what I mean by that is that both hunger and obesity are ultimately the result of a global food system that does not put a value on nourishing people. The primary measure of success has been and continues to be sheer production and to some extent also profitability of that food system. So we know that the global food system has been very successful at producing a lot of food. I mean, that if you look at that trend of grain production and meat production and vegetable production, it continues to go up. But what we need to realize is that this is not the same as feeding people. This is not the same as nourishing people, whether you're talking about people who are hungry or people who are obese. And I think the best example of this comes from the Green Revolution a few decades ago, where in India, grain production increased dramatically as a result of investments in crop breeding and fertilizer use and irrigation. and this was assumed that it would eliminate hunger in India. But what happened was, as grains became more productive and as farmers focused more on it, they began to grow less of other things, including beans, including vegetables. And even though grain production increased, the availability of those other very important ingredients in the diet decreased, and there was an increase in micronutrient deficiency, which is still a very serious problem in India, largely because people began to move away from more traditional dietary combinations of grains with vegetables and with beans, sort of depending on dietary diversity for nutritional diversity. So again, just an example of the fact that sheer production alone doesn't feed us. And we can look to the Midwestern United States for a very similar example, where we have succeeded wildly in producing large amounts of corn and soybeans. At the same time, you might say that the result of this has largely been to make corn and soybean oil and high fructose corn syrup and grain-fed meat wildly abundant, all foods that in one way or another contribute to unhealthy eating in the United States. And this is not even to get into some of the other sustainability issues associated with large-scale monoculture and a reduction in diversity of our food system. So again, just to keep in mind this point, that hunger and obesity, although they might seem like very different problems on the surface, they are both largely a result of a food system that does not value feeding people well. It's mostly focused on production. And if we know that, and if we assume that, I think that the solutions to both hunger and obesity, as this report points out, and as I think we'll get into in the discussion today, the solutions can actually be very much the same, even though the problems seem quite different. And I'll mention just a couple. Focusing on feeding kids in schools and educating children about good eating habits is emerging as a powerful solution, both in settings where hunger is the dominant problem and in settings where obesity is the dominant problem. In the Nourishing the Planet book that came out a year or so ago, we highlighted a World Food Program project called the Homegrown School Feeding Program that's been piloted in about a dozen African countries to provide food in schools in Africa, to provide free lunches, essentially in a very similar way as the New York City school district does and school districts all over the United States do for students, but to do it entirely from local food production. So in Kenya, in Nigeria, in other large countries, you now have a million or more kids in those countries being fed in schools, being given free meals in schools, supplied entirely from food grown and processed in that country. And what we know just from this pilot program is it helps reduce hunger among those children. It reduces families' budgets. The families need to spend money on food because their kids are being fed at school, and it gives them an incentive to send their kids to school. And so that's in a hungry setting where focusing on kids is an important solution. On the flip side, the edible schoolyard movement and the farm-to-cafeteria movement in this country has shown tremendous amount of effectiveness in educating children about healthy eating, basic cooking skills, basic gardening skills, making kids more open to trying new vegetables, eating vegetables, and also going home and demanding better meals from their parents and from their families, and actually helping out in the cooking of those meals. So again, in two very different contexts, in poor, hungry countries and in wealthy, overweight countries, focusing on kids has presented itself as a great conceptual solution. And I would also put in that category focusing on vegetables, focusing on reducing food waste, which I think we'll hear more about, and thinking about the role of our food system in reducing climate change. Again, something that has benefits for poor, hungry countries and also for wealthier countries. And I think we would do best to address both of these problems at the same time. Thank you.
Okay. Brian, thank you. The next question we'll get into is another dimension of this this issue of who has food, who doesn't, and that's and as Brian mentioned, it has a lot to do with income. And this question is addressed to Kelly at One, and your organization talks about growth in the agriculture sector and the way improving agricultural productivity is twice as effective in reducing poverty. And I'm wondering if you could give us some examples or show the way that occurs.
Definitely. Thanks a lot for the question, Sam, and thanks to Danny for organizing this event, and thanks to Barilla for putting out an amazing book and filling a really unique and innovative niche in the study of our food system. And I'm really excited to be here with a group of people not wearing suits. I'm based in Washington, so this is really refreshing. So just to give some background as to why one uses statistics such as this one, which is that growth in the agriculture sector is twice as effective at reducing poverty as growth in other economic sectors like mining, manufacturing, and services. So One is an advocacy and campaigning organization. We have 3 million members around the world. Most of them are concentrated in the United States. We work to reduce extreme poverty and preventable disease. But we do not do development programs in the field. We're strictly advocacy and campaigns. We don't take money from our members. We just look for their voices. So essentially, we take all the energy in this room and all the knowledge and try to channel it towards political change and real policy changes. And it's more difficult than it sounds, I think, at times. But that's what we do. And this particular fact and statistic is really compelling and succinct because it's a tough job to boil down what is really complex, such as a food system and what needs to change, and make it accessible to enough people that it requires in order to make an actual change in policy. And I can't emphasize how difficult it is. But we need voices and as many people as possible to understand these issues. And the statistic itself makes sense if you think about it. Agriculture employs unskilled and low-skilled people around the world, people that already have land. It's very labor-intensive in most places, unlike mining, which employs a few high-skilled people, unlike manufacturing, which is becoming more and more automated as time progresses. So it's really important that we reach those people that are the poorest of the poor and some of the farthest off places with an economic activity or improving the economic activity that is their livelihood. And that's sort of the crux of this activity. And really, and poverty reduction isn't the only measure. I think that this book does a good job of coming up with some ideas for more comprehensive measures of well-being. And I hope that we can hear more about that later from some of the other panelists. But I just want to point out also that not all agriculture is the same. And some of the programs that we like the best don't just reduce poverty in the short term, but they also address undernutrition, they address food prices, and the environment. And so one of them is the Vitamin A for Africa program in Southern Africa. And basically, that program is introducing the orange-fleshed sweet potato to Southern Africa, which we know here it's our common sweet potato, and it has a lot of vitamin A. We all know that. But in many parts of Africa, it's a white or yellow sweet potato that doesn't have a lot of vitamin A. So the program introduces this crop to farmers, to smallholders that are often women, and then also educates the populace and mothers and children about the importance of vitamin A and of that orange flesh, so it becomes sort of a marker in the market. And we think that's just really cool in terms of having nutrition sensitivity within an agricultural development program. Another one I really like is the Purdue, as in Purdue University, Purdue Improved Cowpea Storage program. And this is a really simple one. It's just bags, basically, bags that are sealed really well. And it seems simple, but in Africa, in most places in Africa, I think the figures are astonishing. About 30 to 40% of harvests are lost to rotting, not having refrigeration or bags in this case, or understanding good methods of drying out grains and other crops. And so what happens is, and this is where the food prices comes in, when farmers harvest their crops, they don't have a way to store it, they all sell it at the same time. And that causes the price of the crops to plummet, and their incomes are very meager as a result of that. And then they spend that income in a few months, and then they don't have anything else, and they don't have any crops to buy, so there are crops to eat of their own, or then also their income is gone, and everybody else is in the same position. And so the prices of the crops on the market go up, and it becomes even more unattainable. And so it's a vicious cycle. So giving farmers, very small, poor farmers, the ability to store food for a few months is incredible, so that they can sell their crops for 3 or 4 times as much just a few months later. So this has been transforming lives, about 200, 300,000 lives across Africa. In West Africa in particular. It's a really amazing program. And the third one I want to talk about really quickly is the evergreen agriculture movement, which is happening in Malawi, Zambia, Burkina Faso, Niger, and a couple of other countries. And it's basically agroforestry, so planting trees on one's property and managing those trees so that they can use the leaves from the trees for sale, for compost. Also, the trees fix nitrogen in the soil in a lot of cases, and which makes the soil more fertile for other crops that they're growing. They help with moisture retention, and all of this helps improve farmers' incomes. And so all 3 of these, while conserving the environment in that case, now all 3 of these programs, I think, are huge bang for their buck compared to sending food aid overseas on a regular basis. And as you alluded to, local purchase of food aid and food assistance is incredibly important. But I won't get into that right now. I will say, and I do just want to emphasize that not all agriculture is created equal, and that nutrition is incredibly important. And I want to thank the Barilla group for putting the Barilla Center for putting together such a comprehensive look at our world food system. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And next we'll move to Jonathan, who's going to address a sustainability question. And it kind of dovetails, I think, with the cowpea example we just heard about. Because Jonathan has written extensively about how much food we waste, which is quite incredible, actually, if you read his book. But this problem isn't just confined to the U.S., and I'm wondering if you could give us a global sense of how much food is wasted and what the implications of that are, especially since we also hear how we need to produce more food.
Sure. Well, good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you to the Barilla Center for having us. I'm looking forward to this discussion and also to the reception afterwards, where I've convinced the caterers to serve leftovers from a previous event. And no one's leaving until we finish them. Okay, maybe not. So jumping in, how much food are we wasting on a global level? Well, about 1/3 of all the food produced for human consumption is not, in fact, consumed. That certainly adds up. It amounts to about 1.3 billion tons of food. And that's just an astronomical figure, but what does that actually look like? Well, when I talk about U.S. food waste, I often say that every day we are wasting enough food to fill the Rose Bowl, which is a 90,000-seat stadium in California. Well, every day, the world is wasting enough food to fill 17 Rose Bowls. So it certainly adds up. It's important to note that in that 1/3 figure, that includes both loss and waste. And in policy circles, we distinguish between those two terms, and it gets into semantics a bit. But But loss speaks to food not used primarily in the developing world, whereas waste is mostly about food that isn't being used in the developed world. And there is a culpability with waste, a human decision made somewhere throughout the food chain that dooms that food to not being used, whereas in the developing world with loss, it's something that happens, as Kelly mentioned, primarily due to lack of infrastructure or poor technology. So what's going on here? Why are we wasting so much of our food? In the developed world, there are three main reasons why we're wasting so much, the so-called ABCs of waste. It's abundance, beauty, and cost. So starting off with the first one, abundance, we are creating so much more food than we need, and that does come at a cost that I'll get into a bit later. But in the United States, for example, we're producing about twice the amount of food that we need on a calorie basis. So when you hear that, it's not terribly surprising to learn that we then turn around and waste about 40% of that food. And that abundance is happening throughout much of the developed world. And so there's that actual abundance, but then there's also a perceived abundance. In our day-to-day lives, we see food to such a massive extent at the supermarket. We see it piled high, and pretty much everywhere we go, we are inundated with images of food, whether it's in magazines or on TV ads or really even seeing food for sale in all kinds of places, from gas stations to retailers to pharmacies, that it creates this sense that we don't have to be careful with our food because it's everywhere. And as a result, we aren't. And so we squander it. The next reason there, beauty. We expect our food to be pristine and even pretty. And it's reached a point where appearance often trumps taste with our food, and that comes at a cost. So anything that has the wrong shape, size, or color, or, God forbid, has a small blemish, those items will be cast aside somewhere throughout the food chain. So in order to get that perfect apple to the supermarket, there's a tremendous cost, and there's a winnowing process that happens from farm to fork. In doing research for my book, I worked at a supermarket, and part of my job was going through those displays and culling things that didn't look right. And I understand that you're going to select the perfect apple as opposed to the blemished one, but that doesn't mean the blemished apple is then trash. And then with cost, quite simply, our food is too cheap in the developed world. Now, despite rising food prices, in the U.S. in particular, we're spending less than we ever had when you look at the percentage of household spending that goes toward food. And so as with abundance, that creates this sense that we don't have to be careful with our food because we don't tend to value things we don't spend much on. And in the developing world, that's not as much the case, so that's why there's much less waste there, about 10 times less waste than there is in the developed world. Okay, so moving on to the all-important part about sustainability. Our abundant wasting of food impinges on sustainability in three main ways, in ethical, economic, and environmental ways. From an ethical standpoint, and this gets a bit into the food for all discussion, but to simply have 1 billion hungry people over here and to be wasting 1/3 of our food, that just does not make any sense, and it's what I would call morally callous. So that is also what I would call the disgrace of plenty. So we need to figure out a way to rectify that situation. From an economic standpoint, it's simply a poor use of financial and human resources to pour so much into producing food that we're not going to use and to keep doing so. And then from the environmental standpoint, there's two main factors. There are the resources used that go into growing our food, and then there are the greenhouse gas emissions. When we talk about resources, what I mean mostly is oil and water. And we we have such an oil-intensive agricultural process, and the best estimates that we have is that 4% of all U.S. energy goes into producing food that's ultimately not used. So, everything from planting to fertilizing to harvesting, cooling, shipping, processing, cooking, and then when we're done with that food and throw it out, the diesel used to ship it off to the landfill, that's just an incredibly energy-dense process. So that energy embedded in the food is then squandered when we throw away the food. Similarly, with water, agriculture is a real water hog, and about 70% of global water use, freshwater use, goes toward agriculture. So similarly, when we are not using so much of our food, there's a great loss of water that's embedded in our food. And just to give you a sense on what that actually looks like, the water embedded in the food that we don't use would amount to 2 times the volume of Lake Erie, or on an international level, half the volume of Lake Victoria. So it's just a massive amount of water that is going for naught through our food waste. And then finally, with greenhouse gases, when we throw away food, when we send food to the landfill and it decomposes without air, it creates methane. And as many of you know, methane is a greenhouse gas that is at least 25 times as potent as CO2 at trapping heat. So simply put, we are aiding climate change from our kitchen waste bins. The other thing that I will mention really quickly is similarly, we are using up land and denuding the soil through the food that we don't use. We are not allowing our soil to regenerate and growing on too much of our land, given that we're growing so much food and then throwing away a whole bunch of it. So the other factor there is that our growing demand for food is causing great amounts of deforestation, as you've heard. And so there's this drive to create more arable land. And to me, that is a mistake when we're growing so much already that isn't being used. So just to conclude on this final thought here, the underlying question of the day is how do we feed a planet of 7 billion and even 9 billion in 2050? The answer to that question is certainly a complex one, but from my perspective, I believe we start by being as efficient as we can be with the food we do have.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Next, we'll move to Stephanie Hanson of One Acre Fund. And Stephanie, your organization works with farmers in Kenya and Rwanda, and you help them improve production. And maybe you're actually dealing with some of these issues that Jonathan's been talking about. But I'm wondering if you could describe what, from your perspective, the farmers need most, I guess, to ensure that they have a nutritional food supply.
Absolutely. So I hope it's not a cop-out answer, but I'm actually going to say they don't need one particular thing most. They actually need a number of different things simultaneously. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say I think that Jonathan's discussion on both food waste and food loss is just incredibly striking in comparison to the situation that most smallholder farmers in the developing world face. One Acre Fund works in Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi with about 134,000 smallholder farmers. One of those farmers in Kenya that I know quite well, her name is Leonida, and before one of her harvests with One Acre Fund, she was in a period called the hunger season. She was down to one meal a day, in some cases was skipping meals, and she went to a training session that One Acre Fund was offering on post-harvest storage for maize. And during that exercise, there was a demonstration on how to shell your maize cobs correctly. And it was held in a church in Western Kenya. After the meeting was over, there were some kernels of maize on the ground. And she actually went and picked them all up and put them in her purse to take home with her to cook that night into some kind of maize meal or gruel for her children. I mean, to me, this is just the polar opposite of what we talk about here in the United States, where, the abundance of food around us makes us think that, the broccoli went bad and you throw it in the garbage, it's not a big deal. To this woman who's literally picking kernels of maize up off the floor, I mean, she's mortified to be doing it, but she wants to have some food to bring home to her children. So I think when we start talking about smallholder farmers in the developing world, we do have to talk about production increases. We are producing more food than we need globally, but there's a distribution of food issue. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we really do need to increase food production among smallholders. One Acre Fund believes that the way to do that is to offer the small farmer a complete service model that includes the distribution of inputs, financing, education and training, as well as market facilitation. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those pieces in a minute. The reason that we believe it's important to address all four pieces of the value chain at once is because if you address one and not the others, the farmer's not going to be successful. If you were to give a farmer a loan of, say, $100 US so that they could go out and buy seed and fertilizer to plant and increase their production, in many cases that farmer wouldn't be able to find a place to actually buy seed and fertilizer. There are very few agro dealers in rural areas. Even if the farmer were to be able to find that seed and fertilizer, in most cases, they wouldn't know how to use it correctly. So for many farmers, their traditional planting method involves putting their hand in a bag of seed and throwing that seed out in the field. If they have a bag of fertilizer, they're going to do exactly the same thing. Put their hand in the bag of the fertilizer, throw the fertilizer in the field. That's not how you apply fertilizer. If you do that, your fertilizer is going to burn your seed, and that extra investment that you've made in something to increase your production is actually going to damage your germination rates, and you might not get a harvest at all. So training on how to use that seed and fertilizer correctly is imperative. At the same time, if you plant correctly, you've got money to buy that seed and fertilizer, use the seed and fertilizer correctly, at the end of the season, when you get that great harvest, the question becomes, how do you prepare it correctly, and how do you get it into storage so that it doesn't get infested with pests or rot due to moisture? For that to happen, you need two things. You need storage materials, but you also need to know how to actually process that crop correctly to get it into that simple storage bag that Purdue has produced for cowpeas in West Africa. So One Acre Fund, about 6 years ago, developed an operating model to address all four parts of that value chain for the smallholder farmer. We distribute hybrid seed and fertilizer very deep into the rural areas of the 3 countries where we work, so that a farmer only has to walk about 1.5 miles to pick up their seed and fertilizer. It's incredibly easy. They don't have to hire a motorbike or anything. They don't have to incur large transportation charges. They just walk to a point very close to their home, pick up that seed and fertilizer, and maybe transport it back on a bicycle or a motorbike at a relatively low cost. They receive that seed and fertilizer on credit. Most of our farmers don't have a lot of cash when it's time for planting. It would be impossible for them to buy seed and fertilizer at that time of the year. So we offer the seed and fertilizer as a loan. We call it asset-based financing. And the farmer will repay us in cash over the course of the agriculture season. Each farmer's loan is tailored to their growing season. For maize in Kenya, the loan term is 10 months. For beans in Rwanda, the loan term is 6 months. But it's designed so that the farmer has enough cash by the time the final loan repayment date to actually clear that loan. The third part of our operating model is extension and training. We have a network of now about 650 full-time salaried local staff working in the rural areas in Western Kenya, southwestern Rwanda, and central Burundi, delivering education and training to our farmers on how do you plant correctly, what's the right time to plant, when do you weed your crop, how do you create compost? In Rwanda, what methods can you use to prevent erosion on hillsides? Things that are both focused on that season that they're actually working in, as well as things that they can do to steward their land for future seasons. Those field officers are each working with about 225 farmers. So the ratio of teacher to farmer is quite good. In most public extension systems in sub-Saharan Africa, so government-funded agriculture education and training, the ratios are one extension worker for sometimes tens of thousands of farmers. So it's very, very difficult for farmers to get good current agriculture information. The fourth part of our operating model is market facilitation. So a few weeks before that great harvest is ready, our field staff go out into the fields and start talking to farmers about how to take that crop out of the field correctly, how to dry it fully, and how to prepare it for storage. They also deliver some basic business training on understanding market price fluctuations. So Kelly talked a little bit about the situation of the cowpea farmers in West Africa selling everything at harvest and then not having money to buy food when prices go up. For many of the farmers that we work with, they've never had a surplus before, so they don't think about interacting with the market as business people. They think about interacting with the market as consumers. So that's a shift that needs to take place in terms of thinking about this surplus asset that I have. It's not just food, it's my income for the year. And if you keep that food in storage for 6 months, you can get a return on investment that's 3 to 4 times higher than you would have if you had sold at harvest, in addition to having enough food to feed your family for the year. We've found that this combined intervention has great results for the small farmer. We see about a 100% increase in farm income per planted acre in 1 year. And our farmers like the service that we're providing to them. About 98% of them repay their loans and then take future loans with the organization. And because we're short on time, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions from the audience as well as contributions from the other panelists, I wanted to say if you're interested in understanding better how the challenges that smallholder farmers face in East Africa, I would highly recommend, in addition to the Barilla book, a book called The Last Hunger Season, which has recently been published by a journalist named Roger Thoreau, and he actually spent a year following 4 farmers in Western Kenya to understand the hard work that goes into increasing your productivity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, next we're going to turn to the health issue of this discussion, and Ellen is going to talk about those costs, and it's clear that the current food system we have now, there are costs, as we've heard, in terms of malnourishment, obesity, and we also read about health problems related to diabetes, heart disease, etc. And we've also heard and touched on a bit about the environmental costs of the current way we produce food. And I'm wondering if you could make the link between those and talk about this double pyramid concept that the Barilla Center has developed.
Yes. Hi. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. It is really cool. Like Danny said, it's like all the people that you idolize sitting with you in one panel, which is really, really neat. So thanks all for coming. And I just want to we've heard a lot of really some of the bad news about the food system, but just one thing I think is really cool about this gathering and about what this the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition kind of represents, especially to me, is that in Italy, starting in 2009, a bunch of people who were looking at these grave food system issues got together and thought, we need to think of big picture solutions to both hunger and obesity within the context of a better environment and better health. Well, at the same time, I certainly started thinking about that in my own work. I know Brian and Danny at Worldwatch and with the Nourishing the Planet project had been thinking about that. And a lot of these other people on the panel, and certainly a lot of people in the audience, also began thinking about that. There is clearly a critical mass of interest and attention and a lot of intellectual firepower going into these movements. And many of us are really saying so many of the same things. And I think that's an unbelievable potential that we have. And the fact that this book, in reading it, is saying so many of the things that many of us have come to the conclusions ourselves is an incredibly powerful moment, I think, in history for really big picture food system change. So I definitely encourage everyone to read the book and to look at the work that the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition is doing, but also to look at what Danny's been doing with Nourishing the Planet. Certainly a lot of the work that I've been doing with the 30 Project. It's so similar, which is really the power of the movement. One thing I think, though, that we've all touched upon is some of the dire statistics and metrics. And the thing that's been very frustrating to me in working on food issues is that in many ways the metrics are defined by people that are not in this room. And if we look at what real metrics for a healthy food system would be, we wouldn't just define that by yield. Certainly smallholder farmers improving their yield at the farm level is incredibly important. But what that really signifies is something like replication, not just yield. Yield can mean consolidation. Yield can mean big, massive monocropping. Replication can mean smallholder farmers developing better systems at the farm level. We need to really take back and own some of the language around the metrics and how we define success in these spaces. Some of the other things I think are really important when we're looking at metrics is how can we build waste into the metrics? It's really cool that Paolo Barilla mentioned waste as the first thing he talked about when looking at food system issues. To have a big food company focused on that as an important metric is a really powerful thing that we can all take going forward. Another thing I think that gets forgotten in some of these, the conversations, like I said, not in this room, is this idea that if we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 30 years, even things like GM crops or applying more fertilizer and pesticides, Einstein actually already said this. The definition of insanity is doing more of the same thing to get a different result. And we've been doing a lot of these same things for 30 years, and we know they don't work. It's time to rethink and develop different metrics to get different results. A great example of that is, as some of the other panelists have touched on, meat. And sort of this meat conundrum comes up often as, in many ways, the Achilles heel of our sustainable food movement. Well, as people say, as populations start eating and demanding more meat, how are we going to feed them? How will we feed the world of 9 billion if they demand diets like ours? But the flip side of that, the other metric is, if everyone eats meat at the rate that we do, they're going to have the heart disease and diabetes and cancer that we do too. So maybe the question is not, how do the rest of the 9 billion eat as much meat as we do, but how do we balance out our consumption of foods like that, the foods that are worse for our health and worse for the environment, so that we all develop a healthier, more balanced diet. So a great new tool, I think, in many ways, that our government has been using is the plate, right? And so you look at my plate, and we have half of the plate is really fruits and vegetables, and the other half is a combination of grains and meat, and then that little glass of milk up in the corner. Wonder who put that there. But it is an important indicator that that's how we should be really thinking. So I drew you guys a picture. The double pyramid, which you can also see up here, which I think is a brilliant sort of marketing tool for how we think about healthier food systems, is really looking at the pyramid, the dietary pyramid. See my plates and forks? This is diet. Fruits and veggies are the most important things that we should all be eating. We have to think about that from an agricultural perspective. How do we get people to grow and make more accessible fruits and vegetables? These are big policy questions that I know people at One are looking at. How do we develop systems across the developing world to help people grow more and better quality fruits and vegetables? But at the same time, fruits and vegetables, indicated by the tree here, have also some of the lowest environmental impact. So things like, how do we develop healthier soils? How do we keep water and have less waste of water in our agricultural systems? The things that actually help benefit the planet when we're looking for how can agriculture be a solution to problems in the environment and not only a problem, those things are also actually the healthiest foods for people to be eating. So when we get to the meat question and to this kind of assumption that everyone will be eating meat at our rate, we see that meat is actually something we should all be eating not so much of. And it's also the thing that has the biggest impact on everything from the carbon taken, the waste, because of our current ways of producing meat, requiring food that could be fed to people that's instead fed to animals, and also obviously the water and the land. Potentially, we look at sub-Saharan Africa, but also South America, and how much land is being taken up just to grow and feed our meat consumption habits. I think the double pyramid is a great way to show that the diet that's healthier for people is actually the diet that's also healthier for the environment. And if we rethink and reestablish the metrics around which we're judging our own food system and the mirror food systems that are developing around the world, we can use this as a really powerful tool to kind of show people, hey, if we eat in a way that's healthier for us as individuals, it also is the way to eat that's healthier for the planet.
Okay. Great. And finally, we turn to a cultural question with Dan here. And Dan works with a group called the Self-Employed Women's Association. It's one of the largest unionists in the world. And I'm wondering if you could, take this, through this kind of cultural lens, describe what this organization is doing to help preserve food and culinary traditions, and why that's important, and maybe tie it into this wider discussion that we've been having.
Absolutely. I think probably the first question you're asking is, why is a bald white guy talking about the Self-Employed Women's Association in India? But it actually is a privilege and an honor, because it's a pretty amazing group. But Sam, earlier you had mentioned that there's this woman down south who said when you look into an empty refrigerator, you look at food differently. And the Self-Employed Women's Association, or SEWA, having an experience with them absolutely changed the way I looked at the world. And I think that's it's been a powerful experience in my life, and a lot of learnings, and I can share some of those with you today. So again, I'm a bald white guy, and I'm a former brand and marketing consultant. And so big numbers fascinated me. I loved big numbers, right? And I think there's one big number that has come up over and over again today, and that's 1 billion people are hungry. And I think that's such a huge, and also obese, and it's just such a huge number that it's hard to wrap your head around. And I think that one way to think about it is that's the number of people that visit Google every month. Right? That's how big that is. And then there's a few other big numbers just to kind of put that in a realm. There's 1.4 billion people that live on less than $1.25 a day, right? $1.25 pretty much buys you a 20-ounce Coca-Cola. And that's about half as many. So that's about twice as many people that actively use Facebook, right? And then kind of the third big number that people love to throw around is like 2.6 billion people lack access to water and sanitation. If that were a religion, it would be the largest religion in the world, right? So these are huge, big, massive, massive numbers. But the problem is that they're completely useless, right? Nobody can solve a problem that big. I don't care if you're Bill Gates or Barack Obama or the UN or the World Bank, or Danny Nierenberg for that matter. But I think but that's like, so I was in this world and I was thinking about these big numbers. I was like, wow, how can I be a part of this and a positive part of this? And then I met Rima Nanavati, right? Rima Nanavati is one of the leaders of the Self-Employed Women's Association. And she made the mistake of inviting me to go to India and visit SEWA and see their work. And I said, absolutely. 2 days later, I sent her my itinerary, and I said, listen, put me to work. Let me, I want to do something. I don't just want kind of the tour. And so here I was. I found myself in rural India touring around and meeting with just dozens and dozens of women. Right, because the Self-Employed Women's Association is a pretty amazing organization. It started back in 1972 when Ela Bhatt was a young lawyer, and she saw that street vendors were being pushed out by shop owners and the police. And she goes, you know what? I know the law, and that's against the law. So she literally took this case all the way to the High Court of India on behalf of really poor and marginalized women that were these street vendors, and won. So she won this Supreme Court case in India and founded Sewa. And now today it is a 1.3 million person strong union, all women, all what we would call poor, or poorest of the poor, street vendors, rag pickers, poor artisans, poor farmers. And for the first time in their lives, they have a voice. And in addition to that, they have a platform, and they also have resources by which Sewa is providing them by just the pure collective nature of the organization. It is the largest union in all of India. But REMA in particular, and then to Sewa in general, flipped my thinking. And it was not about big numbers. It was all about small is beautiful, right? You can't solve the global food crisis in one fellow swoop, right? But what you can do is you can put a huge dent into it or solve the food crisis in Sedla Village by building a check dam for $3,500 that collects excess rainwater and can now be used for irrigation to increase yields in Sedla Village. And so that's, or you can't solve the global water crisis, but you can solve the water crisis in Vashrajpur Village by putting in a $5,000 well that's on a sustainable source of water. So women aren't walking 4 hours a day for water, but instead actually now have their time and their freedom back and start small businesses because of that. And that was really the kind of the revolution or the swift kick to the head that I had by interacting with Sewa. And that's why I founded Citizen Effect. And the whole idea was, what the Gates Foundation is doing, what the World Bank is doing, what the UN is doing, there's some really, really good programs there. But actually, there's also some really, really, bad programs with unintended consequences. So how do we actually bring in citizens, people like us sitting in this room, and actually, instead of going and telling people what to do in far off parts of the world that we define as quote unquote poor, how do we actually partner with them in order to create a more self-reliant and sustainable life? And that's what Sewa is all about, and that's really the belief that Citizen Effect was created. So now we go around the world and we find amazing partners like Sewa to supply small but critical projects, whether they're in the food sector or the water sector or the health sector, then match them up with passionate citizens here who are like, you know what, I don't want to just give $50 anymore. I know that my lifestyle and the way I'm living is actually having, probably a negative impact on the world or someone in the world. I want to be now directly part of the solution. So we provide a platform by which those two parties to come together and give people the tools, technology, and training in order to get that project done and funded. And I kind of want to end on this last kind of story. Is one of the first trips I took to India. I ended out in the district of Kutch, which is one of the driest, most places in the world, right? And there are just cotton field after cotton field, right? Which I didn't really know much about any of this then, but I was scratching my head because I knew from some article that cotton was one of the thirstiest crops on the planet. And here we are in one of the parts of the world that is the most water starved. And so here we have pumps pulling water from deeper and deeper wells and aquifers, trying to irrigate cotton and produce cotton, while there's tanker trucks of water being brought in to provide drinking and personal water for the people. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. And really, this is what Sewa was all about. Sewa was like, no, we need to be working with local communities to produce their own food, right, in a responsible way. We need to treat them as the experts and with respect for this indigenous knowledge that they have, because a lot of the reasons why they don't know how to do things now is because the game has been switched on them. They're like, hey, grow cotton instead of sorghum and millet. And now when you get them back into their kind of traditional modes of growing food and growing things, now this indigenous knowledge can really come back and be the asset that really helps them achieve sustainability and feed their family and community. So thank you very much.
Great. So we've touched on a lot of topics, and we're going to open up to a Q&A now. But I think I'm going to throw out the first question as something, just sort of building on what Dan was saying. And I know Brian has written about this and others, and I encourage all the panelists to, let's have a conversation, let's jump in. And I'm wondering if we could discuss this dichotomy between sort of global approaches, global solutions, and local solutions. And in your own work, I mean, do you find that the solution comes locally, or is, in many cases already there and just needs to be encouraged? Or, where does the global approach work? Because we often hear, as Ellen said, if everyone ate less meat, we'd have more nutrition. Or as Jonathan said, if we, obviously we could increase our food yields if we just wasted, 15% less food, our food yield would go up by 15%. And, and others say we just need this new kind of seed, and that's kind of the kind of, all those approaches, focus on a specific approach, but I'm wondering if we could talk about this, relationship between the global and the local. You want to kick off, Al?
Yeah, I think the quickest answer that I have is that the answer is on our plate. And it really is, because the most powerful people in this game, in many ways are American consumers. And when you look at, especially in our lifetime, my lifetime, the last 30 years, the consolidation that's happened among, food companies, meat, going back to meat, the thing I talked about before, 4 companies control 80% of the meat that we eat in this country. One company controls about 40% of our dairy. That is a stranglehold on political power that I know one is up against, that affects not only us, but it affects people all around the world. The balance between whether we're eating sugar or whether we're eating high fructose corn syrup has not only massive health implications, but massive political and trade implications for farmers all around the world. And I think we have only, some people here that are leaders in this space have known this for a long time, but consumers are just starting to realize that, we have to stop this separation of I give to a charity, but I live my life. If you don't embed in your, pedestrian daily activities, your philanthropy, we literally can't change the world. So my mantra is always, if we change dinner, we actually can change the world.
Okay. Anybody else want to?
And I would just like to build on that and say that sometimes, money to charities is really important, but your voice with your Congress people is worth 30 high-paid lobbyists in Washington saying the exact same thing. I promise you, it's worth so much that you call your congressperson and tell them what you think, tell them what you believe in, tell them, I support, I believe that we should be investing in agriculture, good agriculture overseas. I believe that we should allow, if we're going to do food aid, if we're going to intervene in emergencies, we should be purchasing that food locally, not shipping it from Iowa because Cargill wants us to. We really need to make our voices heard. And I think sometimes people have this psychological hurdle that says, I can't make that phone call. It just would be too hard. That those people are unattainable. But anybody here you can go on the House.gov website and send an email from the website to your congressperson and just voice your opinion on these issues. And I'm focused on the foreign policy issues, but also on domestic issues. And right now we're in the midst of deciding the country's farm policies and conservation policies for the next 5 years. The Senate has passed their version of this farm bill, and the House will be debating it in the coming weeks. So I encourage you, if you believe in what everybody's saying up here and what you think and what is in the book that the Barilla Center has put together, call and make your voice heard. Send an email, write a letter, do something. I think that's really, we forget that we can impact these things and that you can link the global and the local right there in that phone call. It doesn't even have to be, you don't have to have some elaborate conceptual linkage there. Just say the things that you believe in.
Right, so maybe there we're talking about, political participation, And I mean, Stephanie, I'm wondering if in your work, if you could talk about this issue of, bringing solutions rather than, as opposed to cultivating solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, One Acre Fund operates with the philosophy of farmers first. And what that means is that we listen to what our farmers tell us that they want and need. It's the reason that the organization focuses on, for instance, staple food crops. That is a counterintuitive approach in agriculture development circles. It is commonly believed that the best and fastest way to help a smallholder farmer get out of poverty is by growing high-value cash crops. A cotton, a chili pepper, a mushroom, a passion fruit, something like that. We actually started out and tried doing that in Kenya, and it really didn't work. At the same time, we were trying to start a small operation in Rwanda, and the person who was leading that operation had a lot of conversations with farmers, and what they were saying to him was, we want to learn how to grow beans better. We want to learn how to increase our production of beans, which is, by the way, a very nutritious crop that people were already growing. And so in Rwanda, our country director said to our Kenya country director, I'm listening to these farmers. And the Kenya country director said, what about the high value cash crops? That's what all the research says works. And Eric said, I'm going with what the farmers say. We're doing staple food crops. And that has been incredibly successful. And the first season after it worked in Rwanda, our Kenya country director said, you know what you're doing is working, and I'm bringing that to Kenya. So I think that's an example of the local solution from Rwanda. It also works in Kenya. And when we started talking to the farmers there, having the same kinds of conversations, we found out the same thing. Of course, in Kenya, it's a different food crop. It's maize. Right. So the solution is not exactly the same, but it's tailored to that local context.
Right. And actually, we got a follow-up question from either Facebook or Twitter from researchers at the World Vegetable Center in Arusha, Tanzania, and they actually, Kelly, want to ask you whether whether your organization is also looking into investing in nutritional security rather than just favoring starchy staple crops. I'm not sure what they're, maybe you could talk about this distinction and how that, what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, whether it came from Facebook or Twitter, thank you, World Vegetable Center, because I didn't get to talk about vegetables earlier, but we do think that they're incredibly important. And in all of our countries of operation, we are doing a small add-on to our core loan package, which is focused on a local vegetable crop. So in Kenya, that crop is called sukuma wiki. It's basically a local kale. It's incredibly nutritious. People eat very little of it because right now in most small farms they're growing very little of it, and what tends to happen is that people focus on their main crop, which is maize, and they say, oh, we'll deal with whatever other crops we do, the vegetables or the sweet potatoes, we'll deal with that later. And what we're encouraging our farmers to do is actually to plant those nutritious vegetable crops year-round. It is possible to do it. It just requires changing your cultivation practices and the way that you allocate labor across the year. So I think that it's always really difficult to have conversations around changing food consumption habits, changing what is on that dinner plate. But we are trying to help our farmers through very simple trainings, see that integrating more vegetables into the diet doesn't have to require a huge increase in labor on their farm or a huge increase in cost.
Right. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think my opinion on this, both kind of working with SEWA and professionally as well as personally, is like food is local, right? I think, and if it's not, then you are creating dependence, especially in kind of the foreign realm. Like once you start doing cotton and these other cash crops that even if they're food, to sell to the other market, now you've made this farmer kind of hostage to the global market. So what happens a lot is one of the large multinational organizations goes out and said, hey, like do coffee, do cotton, do X, Y, or Z. because it's going to be great for the market. It's a really high price, but then they're promoting that all over the world. And so all of a sudden then, now you have a glutton coffee or you have a glutton cotton, and boom, now the price drops and the farmers are now indebted and they can't pay back their debt. But I think it's really important for all of us to kind of hold that mirror up to ourselves as well and ask, are we actually really dependent as well? I mean, if we look, if we raise our hands right now and say, how many of us actually grow any of our own food? Okay. So, let's think about how we eat our food. We are completely dependent on other people to provide us our food, to cook our food. And we've kind of entered this era where we think cooking is opening up a container and nuking it, right? That's not cooking, that's heating, right? So, I think in a lot of what we talk about globally around dependence, actually, we really need to think about actually in our own society, in our own culture, about how we think of food and being dependent or independent on food.
Yeah, and the solutions that are going to work over the long term, and also in those settings where all the other solutions we've tried have not worked for decades, are going to be locally adapted. And that doesn't mean they were invented locally, but it was a concept that came to the area and then was modified so that it could actually work in that area. And you think of the experience with agroforestry, which has spread across Africa, is now growing in the Midwest of this country and elsewhere in Southeast Asia and South America. It's not one species that all these farmers are planting. It's, forest crops that are adapted to that area that people have chosen to, work in this system of agroforestry, which, reduces, locks carbon in the soil at the same time as it generates income for farmers. So I think we're moving away from silver bullet solutions that come from one source towards these, very diverse, locally adapted principles that can be used in different contexts. That's kind of a powerful shift in our approach to hunger, which hopefully will reduce all these problems that haven't been solved in the past.
Right. And if I might jump in, just similarly in my world, in trying to be more efficient with our food, there's that overarching global vision of just general efficiency, but the solution on the local level is going to vary. When you think about food recovery, for example, in a place like New York City, you have City Harvest, which is really catered to or tailored to recovering food from restaurants and being active in being able to swoop in and get that restaurant excess, but that solution wouldn't work in other places. So, for example, in North Carolina, I'm working with a group called Farmer Food Share, which is going to farmers markets and recovering the excess there and getting it to people who need it. And I imagine the solutions would look very different in the developing world. So yeah, it is taking that global idea and then applying it locally.
And I think the same can be said for foreign assistance within the U.S. government. We are encouraging USAID and other groups to really listen to local governments, national governments in the countries where they work, as well as the people there when determining what are we going to focus on, what are we going to invest our vast resources in as well. And I think we've made some really good shifts in the last couple of years, and we hope to see those moving forward.
Okay. We got a question from a fellow named David at Scientific American via Twitter, and he asks, how does food security mesh with the global urbanization trend? And I think this relates to what we were just talking about, because if we're looking at very local solutions, does that mean the end of food distribution and food companies and Barilla pasta and everything else? So how does that? How do we mesh that? Are we saying keep people on the farms? Are we going to have big urban centers? How are those people going to be fed? Anybody want to?
I'm happy to take it.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think when we're looking across the needs of obviously the massive diversity of global populations that exist today, I mean, in many ways, like as everyone is saying, there are different local needs. I think the trend lines, that of course started very much in the West, probably with Industrial Revolution systems that developed hundreds of years ago, but also are now being really sort of expedited overseas of this mass sort of urbanization, have a lot to do with the fact that if on-farm incomes are not going to be high, then people actually are very rational to move into a city where they might get a job and be able to make more money to feed their families. The irrationality of that is people should be able to feed their families as farmers. And actually, when you then take that picture, that snapshot of global urbanization, especially in the developing world, coming from a lack of ability to sort of continue and maintain farm incomes, then you come back home, you see, well, actually, no, it's quite similar here too. We look at places in the breadbasket of our country, and in many ways a brain drain that has been happening, and a loss of sort of consistent mid-size and small farm incomes in our Midwest. Actually, no, the problems are quite similar. So rethinking how people and families can make a very good living as farmers is an important piece of that, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to go back to land and be a farmer. It means that we can have a great balance of urban and rural partnerships that work better regionally. A great example of this is that the New York City milk shed should be the provider of New York City milk. It's not necessarily always the provider of New York City milk, but there's an incredible amount of farmers that are, right north of here producing really good quality dairy products, and those systems should work better in a smart economic model that then could be replicated to many, many, many different cultures around the world so that farmers and urban consumers can have a good balance and a healthy economy for both.
Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is I think if we look at kind of the economy now and all this talk about creating jobs, probably one of the easiest ways to create a whole bunch of jobs is figure out how to get people back into growing food, especially in this country. But secondly, I think we have to also break the mindset that you only grow food rurally, right? There's, if you look at what's going on in this country and in China, there's a lot of food being grown in cities, and we're doing work in both Detroit and Philadelphia. And when we kind of go into those areas and say, what are the biggest areas of need? One of the very first things that come up is A, we have a lot of food deserts, and B, there's some phenomenal nonprofits popping up and for-profits that are doing urban agriculture. And so I think you can grow a lot of food in the cities, and I think Danny, you've probably done a lot of work on this, and also the fact that I think that what maybe one of the biggest growth areas of the economy, like you were saying, Ellen, is actually in the growing food sector of the United States.
And not just growing food in cities, but cities that want to feed themselves better in the future need to invest in all sorts of food infrastructure. Yes, community gardens and rooftop gardens and indoor farms. But in New York City right now, there's a big program to get more locally grown fruits and vegetables into bodegas, which is a major source of produce for low-income, food-insecure populations. And part of that is investing in the big food distribution hub, Hunts Point in the Bronx, and making sure that food up there is segregated by region and it's available for bodega owners to go and get it. So there's been talk over the years of eliminating that food hub. If New York City didn't have that food infrastructure, there'd be no opportunity to have that sort of program. So all sorts of food infrastructure needs to be expanded in cities, not downsized and outsourced.
Mm-hmm. I imagine cost is a big constraint in terms of having a market that's ready to buy food. Because I don't know about here in New York, but in Washington, locally grown food is usually it's a lot more expensive, and you have to make a certain amount of money in order to afford it. And I would love to hear from our domestic experts about how it works elsewhere, where it is competitive on a price level for lower income people.
Yeah, a lot of the work that's going on in Detroit that we've seen is actually most of the urban gardening is actually all for low income, and so they're basically saying, hey, here's a food desert, here's a community that does not have access to high nutritious food, and then they're putting together both gardens and farms and kind of the system by which they can then get that food to the population that needs it. So I know that we don't have all the data on that, but there's a lot of very dedicated and smart people that are working on that exact cost issue.
There's really no reason why local food should be more expensive. To have a banana flown in from halfway across the world compared to your local potato or whatever it may be, there should be some savings to be had. It's just a question of getting the volume and the volume of sales to lower that price. And how do you do that? Well, you need to create the demand. So the more we get people wanting to eat local food and acting on or voting with our fork, the better off we will be in making it competitive.
And this is all about the farm bill that you just were talking about, right? So Food Democracy Now! Right now is running a phenomenal online campaign about getting out to your representative and congresspeople. So if you like you were saying, go do it. Go to fooddemocracynow.com, and they will do exactly what you're talking about.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, a lot of you work for NGOs, and one question that came from via Twitter from Forum for the Future is, does the panel see a role for the private sector in ag development, given its huge impact and influence? And I would kind of add to that and just say, sort of the classical economic model is that, the best solutions, the most efficient ones, are the ones that survive and that point the way forward. And what we seem to be talking about here is sort of the shoulds in terms of what should happen, but obviously private markets have their own way of acting, good and bad. So I'm wondering if we could get into that, the role of private sector. Go ahead. Yeah, do you want to?
So first, maybe I'll start by saying, though One Acre Fund is a nonprofit organization, we do consider ourselves to be part of the private sector. We are partially funded through grant funding, but the majority of our revenues come from the farmers that we serve. So about 83% of our field operating costs are covered through farmer loan revenue. We're moving towards financial sustainability because we're trying to build a case to the private sector that that a smallholder farmer is a customer that they can make money from. And we're trying to do that because this market is incredibly underdeveloped. We need fertilizer companies who are thinking, how can we sell fertilizer to a small farmer? We need seed companies who are saying, how can we get our seeds to small farmers? We need commercial banks saying, we want to do agriculture financing. We need all of those private sector actors in the space to make products that are more competitive for the smallholder farmer. I think the more competition there is in this space, the better it is for the customer, the small farmer. Yeah, Though, maybe I would just issue a caveat to that. I am primarily interested, and I think a lot of people here on the panel would be, in seeing private sector development in the countries where farmers are living. So the Kenyan seed company that's providing seed to farmers, or the East African seed company that's providing seed to farmers. Because I think we know the history of agriculture development globally is that there has been some bad business practices that have happened with large multinational firms going into countries like India and creating dependencies with farmers on the products that they offer. So it is there are a lot of cautionary stories out there, but overall I think the private sector can be beneficial.
I would just say I think we need to break apart two of the phrases that you used, because there's an inherent fallacy in saying that the private sector is the free market. I don't think, if you look at our food system, it actually really operates as a free market. I think the best example of a free market is to go to a farmer's market where you have both information, open information, which is essential for a free capitalist economy, and you have real choice, which is also essential for a real capitalist free market economy. And we don't have that with the amount of consolidation that we have in our current food system, especially in the West. So I am a capitalist. I ran a for-profit company. The for-profit company happened to provide millions of meals for kids around the world, but it was a for-profit business. I believe in capitalism and in, the free market. I don't think that's what our food system looks like today. Another great data point, though, actually piggybacking off of what Stephanie was saying, is that there's a little nugget out there from this awesome bank, investment bank, that invests in farmers called Rabobank. It's a Dutch company. They actually looked at data of farm incomes and about what the most profitable investments in farm incomes could possibly be. They were on the small and medium-sized farms. They were not on massive, conglomerate monocrop systems that we mostly have. Those are not actually the smartest investments. So when we're really looking at what the free market does, it actually helps us eat better. I think, just to touch on this, because we're sitting here with this Barilla sign, the truth is there are a few products that are actually processed food products that companies make, that they can make in a relatively high volume, that are nutritious. And we know what they are. Things like yogurt. Yogurt is a processed food. It happens to also be very nutritious. Breads and pasta, they are actually made from wheat into something else, but they're good for us. So we have to do a better job of separating, look, companies that are making foods that happen to be shelf stable but also are healthy are not falling under the same categories as, some of the fast food companies or beverage companies that we know really aren't making many healthy options. The fact is, big companies can make healthy options, and that's a choice that we have to demand as consumers and push our free market to actually make the more profitable choices.
Yeah, and they will shift if they see that demand, and sometimes it will come from within the industry. I had the pleasure recently of attending the World Instant Noodle Summit in Tianjin, China, and they invited me to speak about what the local food movement meant for the instant noodle industry. I mean, this is like top ramen, cup of noodles, and that industry has made some pretty dramatic shifts, prompted mostly from internal discussions to dramatically reduce sodium in their products, to go to low-temperature frying when there was all of this concern about acrylamide and carcinogens coming up in fried, grain products. And now they're beginning to roll out for the very first time regional flavor products. And this is not just because they have this vision that we need this thing, but they see in China and Japan and India and in the United States that people are starting to demand it. So, should they have been more ahead of the curve and done this years ago? Yes, obviously. But they're willing to often move in that direction. They're not just making, business decisions for their own bottom line.
Okay, great. We have about 15 minutes, and I just want to get some questions from the audience. And there's a microphone here. Some people are already lining up, and we welcome questions in it. But I just emphasize if we could keep it to questions rather than long-winded comments, so the panel has a chance to answer. I'd appreciate that.
Hi, my name is Davida Heller. I'm a student at Columbia University and also with the Earth Institute. And I just wanted to thank you all. This has been so educational and wonderful. And I really commend you for what you've been talking about and bringing up the meat issue. And also to Barilla. What I keep hearing is this increased transparency, this push for transparency in order to get the changes that we need. And I was a little shocked to hear recently that the Senate voted against GMO labeling here. And I'm just wondering, in all of your amazing efforts around the world, how do you see not making the mistakes that we've made and looking at issues like this, and how do we maintain transparency to really empower these farmers so that they have the information that they need in order to make the educated choices and not have a kind of market that you just described that is, we want more of a free market, capitalistic, healthy society globally.
Campaign finance reform. That's the answer. Campaign finance reform.
Well, and in addition, having people clamor for labeling. And, if there isn't that demand, then it's easier for politicians to cover it up. But if we're out there talking to our representatives, if we're pushing for it in social media, I think it's only going to help increase labeling.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, Dow's coming out now with another genetically modified corn that includes something from Agent Orange, right? So they're calling it Agent Orange corn. And then you have the Farm Bill, which is a 5-year bill, like you were saying, dictates how we're going to eat over time. Yet it's not in the media, it's not in the news, it's not written about to the extent that anything else is. I get so many things on student loans are going to double, right? And that's big. I have student loans, and that's an important issue to me. But what I put in my mouth and my kids' mouth every day, and the fact that it's not even in the public discourse. So, I think what you said is absolutely, it's campaign finance reform, but it's also making sure that everybody in this room, everybody watching this video, just screams from the top of their lungs saying, we want to be part of the Farm Bill.
One thing I hear a lot from our communications team at One is that agriculture isn't sexy. How do we make agriculture sexy? And it's really funny because everybody is so excited about the celebrity chefs and about these cooking shows, et cetera. But I think that the traditional media just hasn't really been able to make the link between policy and that sort of celebrity and those popular things. And so, I mean, that's another thing that people here could do, call, if you're not seeing things in the news, call them and say, hey, aren't you going to do any articles or stories on this GMO labeling issue or this new this Agent Orange thing? There's so much that I think is just happens because of a lack of communication.
Well, on that note, I'm just going to give a pitch for the fern.org, because we've actually done articles on the Farm Bill and have a quite in-depth piece on crop insurance, which nobody really knows about, and it's a $9 billion program, so check that out, the fern.org. Another question.
Thank you for an excellent panel. I'm Pam Cook from the Center for Food and Environment at Teachers College, Columbia University. And one of the things that seemed to be a cross-cutting theme across everything that all of you said is combining together creating policies and programs that will increase access to food through production or through accessibility to it, with education about how to use those foods and what to do. And some was talked about the tailoring the programs and making them locally focused. At the same time, education also has to be very individualized. I mean, educating politicians about things is very different than educating farmers in Africa. So I just would like to hear some examples about how education has been done and tailored in ways that have seemed to make it effective to getting what we want and getting a better food system. Thanks.
Well, from what I've seen, you take a program like the Edible Schoolyard, just getting students involved in creating their food and getting people connected to their food in general, that's going to have an impact. So how you do that in a place like New York City versus a rural area, the solution will be quite different, but the common thread should be further connecting people to their food, whether it's growing it or simply getting to know the farmer who produced it, or even just buying from a farmer's market. Any way we can get people further connected to the food, it'll only help.
Yeah, I mean, we've invested a ton in this country and worldwide in education for the farmer and at the production side. I mean, we have this massive extension system that's very good at getting new technologies and ideas out to farmers, and we've neglected almost the entire rest of the food chain, from teaching kids and people how to cook in schools to education for households, and then even education at the supermarket and food retailer and small food retailer level. And I think those are sort of the neglected links in the chain that need more help in getting the good information out there.
That's actually a great point, though, and in my organization's called the 30 Project, because really a lot of changes I noticed around 1980 led to massive impacts today. And one of those changes actually that Brian brought up is we did actually start dramatically reducing public funding to our extension system. And it's interesting to hear you coming from Teachers College at Columbia. There's really a bifurcated education pipeline in food today, where people that are going in many ways to the big ag schools, the extension schools, in the sort of states, one in every state across the country, are really getting much of their information from the funders, who aren't, unfortunately, anymore the public pot of money. They're mostly companies. It's the, corporate school of nutrition, corporate school of agriculture, this pavilion at this agriculture school that's funding all the sports teams. I think we really need to rethink how we are going to fund both agricultural extension, research and programs, but also use that and use those networks that used to actually teach people about canning, teach people about, local gardening, and get back to that. But again, without a sort of a broader sense of interest in public funding for that, or at least untethered money, whether it's coming from corporations or from the government, how do we make a pot of money that's not a specific, very clearly specifically funded, from a food company to a food science program? That's going to be a really important piece of this.
Okay. We have one more question from Twitter. It's from someone named Shamin Okola, who's writing from Kenya, and I probably pronounced his name wrong. But he asks, how do we get the most people who are most affected, that is the global poor and the malnourished, into these discussions and panels? So
it's a great question.
We are kind of all white Americans up here on the stage.
I did notice that as soon as I sat down. It's something we're cognizant of quite a bit, I think, in Washington. And I think it's important to know, the last month, the G8 met outside of Washington in Camp David, at Camp David, and the day before they had a big symposium at which Obama spoke, Bono spoke, Secretary Clinton, a number of people, but the only farmer on the stage, small farmer on the stage, was a large poster of a woman in Africa somewhere. And I think this is really, really important. And one of the things that one has been very much concentrated in the U.S. and in Europe as far as our advocacy is concerned, but we are starting to work a little bit more in Africa. And one of the things that we're really looking at is how do we empower, or how could we help or hold governments accountable to listening to their farmers alliances and networks and unions that are there. And some are organized better than others, but it's a very interesting new field for us, and I think for a lot of people out there that have connections on the ground. And it's so important. When I used to work at Oxfam, and we brought a number of farmers over to speak on panels like this in Washington. And there are groups that do it, but it's expensive. It's very expensive to bring people.
I think the other piece of it for the United States is if you look at the USDA and the FDA, the people that are in those departments are primarily people from industry, right? That's the type of resume that will get you hired, right? And I think it takes some level of political will and courage to be like, listen, we need to have a broader voice, within these departments in order to help make these important decisions. Otherwise, people are going to just do what they tend to know, and if they know the industrial food system, that's kind of the decisions that they're going to make.
I think it's actually less important for the global poor to be featured on, panel discussions in America about how do we end, poverty in Africa, or how do we help smallholder farmers grow more food. But as Kelly says, for them to be effective advocates in the countries where they live, to the governments that should be providing them with basic public services like roads or a publicly funded extension system. It's a really difficult thing to think about. How do you help foster that feedback loop between a group of small farmers and their publicly elected officials in the capital city? But it's actually something that we're investing in at One Acre Fund as well, because when you have, now in Kenya, we have about 78,000 smallholder farmers in Western Kenya. They all vote in every parliamentary and presidential election. And what that means is that when they want something, they should be able to speak directly to their elected officials and say, we need those feeder roads. Are you going to build them for us? If you're not, we're going to vote you out of office. So creating some of the kind of advocacy mechanisms that we already have here in the United States in a place like Kenya or Rwanda, I think is a really important project.
Okay. Yeah, and making sure local media is aware, too. I mean, I think of the work that Fern has done to get these issues out in the open, and also a big part of the Nourishing the Planet project was forming alliances and networks of journalists in those countries in Africa that we were writing about, because even in those places, these issues don't get written about. And getting the editorial boards and journalism schools in those countries on board had a big impact on getting these stories out in the open.
I think we can close with one last question from the audience. Thank you.
I'm Beryl Goldberg. I'm a freelance photojournalist. I've been reading about places in Africa, especially where some big corporations are buying mega swaths of land and producing all kinds of crops and throwing people off. I just wonder if any of you have reactions to that, and I'm sure it's related to local corruption as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess the impact of what's been known as the land grab, or what's being called as the land grab.
It's a frightening phenomenon. I mean, it's related to both local and global corruption. The fact is that international financial markets and certain international investment frameworks allow that to happen. But quickly, a few big investors based in New York and other global power centers around the world are investing in land everywhere, not just in Africa, but in Iowa and big agricultural regions as something that they hope will appreciate, and then even to make it sort of a cash cow investment that they would hold on to as it produces. And there's been efforts to try to shut this down, or at least limit it on the national level and elsewhere. And to date, they haven't been that successful. And And the reality is it's this land grab and other sorts of speculation, the agricultural markets around the world, have also been implicated in more volatility in food prices, which has happened in the last few years. As food prices have gone up, they've also become much more volatile, which is makes life difficult for farmers, for food businesses, for everyone to plan. Nourishing the Planet has done a lot of writing on this too, so you can find information at their website.
Okay, and with that, I want to turn it back to Danny, who will give closing remarks, but thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think this was an amazing discussion. Special thanks goes to Sam for moderating this panel so efficiently and wonderfully. Please join me in giving another round of applause to our speakers. Thank you all so much. Before we go out to the reception to enjoy some refreshments, I just want to thank the members of our Nourishing the Planet team that could be here today. They're a really dedicated group of folks who work very hard. Bernard Pollock handles our communications. Laura Reynolds is our research fellow. David Batchek is our research assistant. And Molly Redmond is our wonderful intern who kept time today. I'd also really like to thank Barilla USA for being here today and all of their support and encouragement and work over the last year. Special thanks goes to Prita Wadwani, Stephanie Sete, Christine Weisenberger, and I'd also like to thank Adelaide Fior from Edelman Communications, who's been so incredibly helpful. Needless to say, special thanks goes to the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition. Without them, this book wouldn't have been possible. It's a really amazing contribution to the food and agriculture development scene, and I'm so, again, proud to have been a part of it. And many thanks to Barilla, the company, for all of their support and encouragement. I am so grateful that all of you could come, and I'll look forward to talking to you and all of the panelists in a few moments. Thank you again.
More than 1 billion people suffer from hunger, while an equal number suffer the consequences of overnutrition. A third of the food produced globally is dedicated to feeding the 3 billion farm animals across the world. An increasing share of agricultural land is used for the production of biofuels, while 5,000 people die every day because they lack access to agricultural resources and clean water. Food and nutrition. Environmental and economic impact. Social impact and disease prevention. The world is hungry for answers. The world is thirsty for knowledge. Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition is a multidisciplinary think tank and research center created for people who dedicate their lives and knowledge to these topics. The activities are guided by a global advisory board, composed of scientists and experts from diverse but complementary sectors, from health scientists to environmentalists, from sociologists to economists. In 2012, the BCFN analyses will range from food waste to the impacts of obesity. The double pyramid, in other words, the food pyramid and its link to the environment, the sustainability of the agri-food industry, and how diet and consumption habits will evolve